Um, Scott Flemming, thanks for giving up part of your Sunday afternoon for us. Scott describes himself as one of those kids who was always interested in birds. And he went on to do an undergraduate degree in animal biology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and then a master's on the diet of little penguins in New Zealand. He came back to Canada and began studying shorebirds in the Arctic. And he now works for Environment and Climate Change Canada as a shorebird biologist for the Pacific region in British Columbia, looking at how shorebirds choose stopover sites and how flexible they are with their migration strategies. Migrating birds remind us that before fiber optics, before the World Wide Web, the world was already connected with migration routes, with currents, with the winds. Like many biologists studying migrating birds, Scott's work has taken him to global issues, particularly climate change and pollution. He was recently selected for a joint fellowship offered by the Arctic Council, the Arctic Council's Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group, and the International Arctic Science Committee, to examine how shorebirds breeding in the Arctic are impacted by plastic contamination. Scott seems to be one of those valuable scientists who seek public engagement. In one paper, he and colleagues present ways that the scientific societies who publish scientific papers can use social media to help engage young scientists to continue to support their crucial work in the advancement of science. It's important to him that his research can inform management and conservation decisions. We're lucky to have him with us today, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing more about his work, as well as how Protection Island might be part of it. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks a lot. That was probably the nicest introduction that I've ever received. So yeah, did a little bit of research. That's great. Okay, so I guess I will try and share my screen again. Let's see. So can everybody, let's get that out of the way. Maybe, yeah, how does that look? Can everybody see that right now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I will be talking, well, I guess first of all, thank you so much everybody for having me here and for that awesome introduction. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about shorebirds. Where do they come from? How long do they stay and where do they go? And specifically about unraveling the migratory behaviors of some shorebirds. And so I would first actually like to acknowledge that this isn't just me that has been doing this work. I've got a number of collaborators. So Amy McDonald, who's kind of this one right here, she's working for Birds Canada around in Delta, and she's the Western MODIS coordinator, and I'll explain what MODIS is a little bit later. Sydney Bliss is my technician at Canadian Wildlife Service at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then we have a master's student, Anne Blondin, right here at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. And then she's being co-supervised by Dr. Erica Knoll right here, also at Trent University. And then my kind of co-conspirator with all this research is Dr. Mark Drever, who's with the Science and Technology branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So I'm the Canadian Wildlife Service and he's the Science and Technology branch. And so we both kind of combine forces to work on issues relating to shorebirds in the Pacific region. So kind of as has already been explained, just a little bit about me. This is me here on the top in a non-pandemic year. This is me here now in a pandemic year. You're probably, most likely, if you ever do see me, I'll be looking more like this, actually, probably a little bit less bundled up now that I'm in BC. This was me working in the Arctic during my PhD. So yeah, as was mentioned, I did a Bachelor of Science at the University of Alberta, and I did an honors project looking at pigeon guillemot nesting behavior, and that was out at Banfield. And then I did a master's at the University of Otago in New Zealand, and for that I was looking at little penguin diet. And then I did a PhD back in Canada at Trent University in Ontario, looking at the effects of overabundant geese on Arctic nesting shorebirds. And I'll be getting into that a little bit later in the talk. And now I'm the shorebird biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service in the Pacific region. So the Pacific region used to be BC and the Yukon, but they kind of previously decided that the Yukon probably fit more with sort of boreal and Arctic, and so it was combined with Yellowknife and Nunavut. And so my main job right now is conducting population assessments, monitoring shorebirds, and kind of trying to implement some specific shorebird conservation in some areas. So I'll start super broad right now and just kind of describe or explain how some birds can play super key ecosystem roles, and kind of make the case that we really need birds. So birds can be really good indicators of environmental change. So it can be easier to monitor seabirds that feed on some fish stocks than actually the fish themselves, because the seabirds will go out, catch the fish, and bring them back at their colony or their breeding colony. So it's easier to just catch the bird at the breeding colony rather than taking a boat out and monitoring the fish stocks that way. They can also signal broad-scale changes such as a warming climate, which many people may have heard about, which is reflected in earlier spring migrations for some species. And then aside from their environmental value, so things like insect control, they can spread seeds while they migrate, or just kind of local movements. They pollinate plants. They can cycle nutrients. Many seabirds bring nutrients from the fish back to their breeding colonies. And then aside from all of those environmental values that they hold, they also hold some significant cultural value for humans. So eagles can hold significant significance for many indigenous communities. Ravens, swallows, and doves frequently appear in Western folklore. Many people birdwatch recreationally. And so birds are easy to monitor. They're relatively easy to identify depending on the species, and they're relatively easy to count relative to other wildlife. And so what makes this recent finding in the last year, you may have seen in the news, or that got a lot of media attention, that there have been serious declines since the 1970s in the number of birds in North America. So 2.9 billion birds have been lost in North America since the 1970s. And this is not only rare birds that are vanishing, but common birds are becoming less common. And so this is hugely concerning. And as a shorebird biologist, I'm particularly interested in shorebirds. And so if we kind of look at it in a different way, so since the 1970s, we can see that shorebird populations have declined by about 40%. So that's the third most significant decline compared to aerial insectivores down here and grassland birds. And so this is really concerning for a number of shorebird biologists across Canada. And so each region has their own shorebird biologist. And so we're kind of all working together to try and understand what's going on, what's driving these changes. And so if some of you may know, some of you may be experienced birders, some may not know, but if you don't know, this is a shorebird. If you're from Europe or the UK, then many people there call them waders. But this is probably one of the most generic shorebirds. This would be a dunlin. It would be a dunlin in its wintering plumage. So we would probably see the Pacifica subspecies of dunlin around BC. And so shorebirds would include sandpipers, plovers, curlews, oystercatchers, turnstones, knots, and yellowlegs. And generally, they're closely related to gulls. They're in the same kind of larger group. But generally, one of the most identifying features for shorebirds is that they're using the shoreline for the majority of the species, not all of them, but in BC, some of the smaller groups, that you'll see them kind of like running along the shoreline, and they'll run, and then they'll peck, and then they'll run, and then they'll peck. And so that would be kind of the classic shorebird. So this would be the dunlin. We also have a very noisy shorebird. Many of you probably know the black oyster catcher. It's the largest shorebird that we have, at least along the coast here. And so you can see them relatively frequently, I'm sure, in the area. And then the most abundant shorebird in British Columbia during certain times of the year is the western sandpiper. And so this would fall into the kind of the generic group of small shorebirds that are kind of a drabbish, kind of brownish, whitish color, and they're generally called peeps. So this would include a dunlin or a western sandpiper, semi-palmated sandpiper, a least sandpiper, and even some experienced birders have a really hard time distinguishing these, especially when you see them during migration in large flocks like this. So this is typically what we would see a flock of shorebirds in BC. So this is a combined flock of dunlin and western sandpipers. And so one of my major tasks is to actually try and count these or get an estimate of how many we have moving through BC at certain areas. And so to do that, we have a long-term study going on that started in the 1990s. Basically, I'll go out and count western sandpipers and dunlin, kind of estimating the number within a flock out at Roberts Bank. I'm actually located in Tsawwassen. Our main office is in Delta. So Roberts Bank, just down the road from my house. I'll go out around mid-April to late May and count or estimate how many birds I see every day during that period. And recently, we found that since the 1990s, the number of western sandpipers that we're seeing has declined fairly significantly. And so this is pretty worrying, especially since they're one of the most abundant species that we have moving through BC. And so we're trying to identify what some of the causes for those declines are. So western sandpipers are a long distance migrant. So they can breed in the Arctic and then migrate down to Central and South America. And long distance migrants in particular are experiencing some disproportionate declines compared to some short distance migrants. And so the kind of the broad idea or the main thought is that habitat alteration at key stopover sites and overwintering areas is thought to be a major driver of these population declines across all shorebird species. That and the general kind of climate change has been, we're starting to understand a little bit more how climate change is affecting these populations. And so habitat alteration and climate change are thought to be the major drivers. But as kind of a regional biologist, I'm interested in understanding the contributing threats. So I can look at habitat alteration in BC, and I can look at climate change in BC, but there are a number of other smaller threats. And so if we have these smaller threats, maybe on their own, they may not be affecting the population. But if you combine them with climate change, or if you combined a number of the smaller threats, then there may be this cumulative effect that is affecting the population. And so just a little bit about general bird migration. So many birds are migratory, so they spend their winters and summers in different areas. And they migrate between these areas in the spring and the fall. So you can think of this kind of like a cycle that they go on throughout the year. So migrations can be short. Birds can migrate a few hundred kilometers, or they can be long, and they can migrate thousands of kilometers between continents. So in North America, we have the red knot, which is a type of sandpiper, and it will typically, depending on the subspecies, will breed in the high Arctic. And then they will migrate down to Tierra del Fuego during the non-breeding season. And so along these migrations, shorebirds generally they'll make a couple of different stopovers. So there's this semi-palmated sandpiper here, which is kind of like the eastern equivalent of our western sandpiper. And so the birds will breed up here, northern Hudson Bay, and then they'll migrate through here, maybe making a couple of stops along the way. Often they'll stop over at the Bay of Fundy, stay there for a couple days to a week, rest, kind of bulk up on some more food, and then either take kind of the eastern seaboard or go take a straight line down to the northern part of South America. And so for the western sandpiper, this is what their yearly cycle or their migration looks like. So they'll start up here in Alaska, migrate down through BC. Some will stay in BC, which is less common, and then they'll overwinter throughout these kind of coastal areas down here. And so I can take you through the general, the general ecology of the species. So a western sandpiper will set up a nest. A male will kind of establish a basic territory, and the female will find the male that she likes, and they'll lay some eggs, or the female will lay some eggs in a little divot in the ground like this. So they don't typically make like the nice nests that you would see up in trees. So they'll have 4 little eggs, and they'll conceal their nests a little bit. They're a little bit camouflaged, but they'll conceal their nests with vegetation. And their main predators would be Arctic foxes, parasitic jaegers, and gulls. And so they breed up here in some flat sort of tundra. This isn't Alaska. This is northern Hudson Bay at the study site that I did my PhD research at. So we would basically be looking throughout this whole area here, wandering out throughout the day, looking for birds, trying to find their nests, and monitoring their nests throughout the season. And then once the chicks hatch, they come out as these fuzzy little birds. So they're incubated in the eggs for 18 to 21 days. At the end of that kind of 20 to 21 days, the chicks will hatch, and they'll leave the nest within 6 to 8 hours of hatching. So they're really precocial. So they're already able to walk around. They don't have any flight feathers yet, but they develop those over the next month or so. So the adults will stay with the chicks for about a week or two, just making sure that the chicks know how to feed. They'll just walk around with the chicks. They're not really protecting them, but they're just kind of showing them how to peck and probe for feed or for food. And then the adults will leave earlier, and they'll leave their chicks out on the tundra. The adults will migrate back down south, and then the chicks will come about a month later. And so generally when we see these birds, so this would be out at the Roberts Bank, and we can see the Delta Port Terminal here in the background. So the birds will migrate down. We'll see the first wave, those would be the adults. We would see those in kind of mid-July to early August. We'd see a large wave of those birds, and then kind of like a month later or 2-3 weeks later, we'd see the juveniles coming through. And then they would make their way down further south. Some of them overwinter, kind of the southern United States. And then some of them will stop over in Mexico. And then continuing on to Mexico, some birds will make it as far down from Peru, or down to Peru. And so this is kind of the Pacific flyway for all of our Western sandpipers here. And so these are the main sites that we're interested in kind of understanding the potential threats and the drivers of these population changes at each one of these sites. So as I said, we're mainly interested in understanding, well, the major drivers are climate change and habitat alteration at their non-breeding sites. But as I mentioned, I'm interested in understanding these cumulative effects. So things like the effects of plastics on shorebirds, or habitat loss at some specific sites. habitat alteration, and then overabundant species. So these aren't necessarily the major drivers, but they could be contributing to this. And so the first kind of threat that I'll talk about is plastics. So these plastics, we don't really understand much about the potential threat of plastics. And so they could be occurring at any point along throughout the migration cycle of the Western sandpiper. And so what we do know, so this is not a shorebird, this is a seabird. And a lot more attention has been given to the effect of plastics on seabirds than shorebirds. So this seabird this is an albatross. This albatross would have mistaken all of these pieces of plastic for some sort of food or prey item floating in the water, ingested it, and then those plastics will build up in the stomach of the bird, and they'll either puncture the intestines or the stomach of the bird, and so the bird will die that way, or they'll just fill up and they can't digest any of it, so they'll feel full all the time, and their body condition will decrease, and they'll starve essentially. And so we know a decent amount about what species are susceptible to plastics for seabirds, but we don't really know that for shorebirds. And so we've been looking to try and combine samples from across the world to look at the occurrence of plastics or microplastics in shorebirds. And so this is the result of this combined effort. And we can see, so this is just the presence or absence of plastics in a necropsied bird or a fecal sample collected from a live bird. And so we can see oyster catchers here. 100% of the oyster catchers that were sampled or necropsied had plastics in it, so they seem to be really susceptible to that. And we think that's because they're a visual predator, and so they're mistaking these colorful colored plastics for mussels or clams or oysters or something. Avocets, which we have in southern BC, turnstones. We don't have very many samples of turnstones, so we're looking more into that. Phalaropes, especially in the Pacific, we do know that phalaropes, which many people classify kind of the gray area between shorebirds versus seabirds, but phalaropes in particular, a number have been found washed up along the coast in BC, and so they ingest a number of plastics. But the Western sandpipers would be the ones that fall within the calidrous sandpipers. So just over 50% of sandpipers that were studied contain some form of plastics. And so overall, 54% of all shorebirds contain plastics, which is way higher than we ever thought, because we didn't think that, based on the way that their feet, they're kind of like probing along the sand, or kind of filtering some of the invertebrates out along the coastal areas. We didn't think that that would be a major contributor to plastics in their diet. So this is something that is relatively new, and we're really keen to investigate further. And so these are the types of plastics that many of the smaller shorebirds are ingesting. So these are little threads. And so these would be coming from like things like fleeces. When they're washed, the fleece will come out and they'll go into the water column through the wash, and then shorebirds can ingest those eventually as they make their way to the coast. And then some larger pieces of plastics can break down and turn into some of these threads as well. And so for the individuals that we do have samples for, so we have Wimbrel, they had relatively low numbers of threads, so 0.1 thread per milliliter. But then Dunlin and pied avocet both have relatively high numbers of threads per milliliter. And so this is kind of a worldwide study that we've been doing. And so now we're really looking at investigating what it's like in BC. So we have very little knowledge of the types of plastics or the prevalence of plastics ingestion by shorebirds in the Pacific region. And we have no knowledge of ingestion of plastics by Western sandpipers. That's not because they don't do it, they could do it, we just haven't looked at it yet. And so that's something that myself and colleagues are starting to look at right now. And so ingestion of plastics, we don't know with shorebirds whether or not there are any lethal effects like with the seabirds. So do shorebirds ingest a bunch of plastics, and do they cause them to die? We really don't know. And then are there any sublethal effects if there aren't lethal effects? So are they ingesting a lot of plastics, and is this affecting their body condition or their behavior or their migration patterns? So this is kind of one of the biggest unknowns that we have right now relating to the plastics. And kind of moving to a different site. So in the Mexico, or in Central America, so Mexico, one of the large stopover sites right here, one of the major threats there is loss of wetlands. So in Latin America, at least 59% of wetlands have been lost. And in Mexico in particular, has lost a number of wetlands, and that has been the major contributing factor of those losses is the expansion of shrimp farms. So in the northwestern region of Mexico since 1999, the area devoted to shrimp farming has more than doubled, and it now encompasses over 51,000 hectares. And so this whole area is a really important stopover site and overwintering area for a number of different shorebird species, especially the western sandpiper. And so each one of these shrimp farms here is a site that could be potentially contributing to the loss of wetland habitat or the alteration of that habitat. And so a basic kind of shrimp farming operation starts with the conversion of coastal wetlands or mangroves into these large kind of constructed ponds here where they can control the water level in those ponds. And so that's where the young shrimp are raised. And once they reach adulthood, or they're ready to be harvested, they drain the ponds completely, and it makes the harvesting. They basically just take crates out there and shovels and nets, and they can just load everything up into their trucks. And then in October and December, that's when they kind of leave the area with very little water. So this is the time that it's really important habitat for shorebirds, because this is when they're migrating through Mexico on their southward migration. And so we, first of all, didn't know how many shorebirds were using these areas after they were altered, or how long they were using these areas. So our first step had been to get a number of people to go down, some colleagues in Mexico, to conduct surveys, and they found within these shrimp farms at certain times of the year, they're finding 1,600. This is the max count, so the largest number that they saw over the survey period. So large numbers of willets, marbled godwits, black-necked stilt, western sandpipers in particular were the most commonly observed type of bird, or shorebird, using those areas. So clearly these shrimp farms could be really important habitat for, even after they've been altered, for a number of shorebird species. But we really didn't know what the effect of that habitat alteration, or the timing of that alteration is. And so if we look at these figures here, we can mainly just look at these ones over here for a number of different species for each one of these plots. This is just the total count. And so we can see during the harvest period, much higher number of shorebirds for all of these species using the shrimp farms. And then once the harvesting is done, the numbers drop significantly. And this is the same sort of figure, but this is just the proportion of counts of those species at the shrimp farm. So basically after the harvest period, then the numbers drop. And so this kind of led us to provide a number of recommendations, working with our colleagues in Mexico. The main recommendations were to retain some wet substrate of ponds after the harvest to try and increase the use of ponds by shorebirds. So instead of just drying it out completely, leave some water so that some invertebrates will actually reside in the area, so it'll attract shorebirds. And we also recommended a continuous harvest up pond, so no breaks between harvest periods longer than 5 days, so that we ensure that there's stable foraging opportunities. So instead of there being a really big peak in the amount of food in those ponds and then dropping off completely, which could really affect the timing or the habitat use of shorebirds in the area. And so these recommendations are being implemented right now with some success, but we really don't know right now whether or not there are any other lethal effects of these shrimp farms that could be contributing to the population declines. And we don't know about any sublethal effects as with the other potential threats. So are birds that are using shrimp farms versus completely natural mangroves or coastal areas, is their body condition different? Or is their behavior different? Is their migration different? So that's something that we're looking to, or we're working with partners in Mexico on right now. Now, as we move further north, the closest to home, I guess. So again, we're at the Roberts Bank and the Delta Port Terminal here. So the two, from what we understand right now, the two major stopover sites for Western sandpipers and many other shorebirds is the Roberts Bank and the Tofino mudflats. And so we're looking to try and compare those two mudflats, and I'll get into that in a little bit. That's what one of our master's students is looking at. So if you've ever been out kind of late April or May, this is basically what the Roberts Bank mudflats look like. So this is just a mixed flock of Western sandpipers and Dunlin. And when I first got out here, I would see these large flocks, and then they'd fly away, and I'd go out and I'd look at the mud to see what they're feeding on. And typically they would be feeding on invertebrates, so tiny little crabs, or polychaetes is a big one, amphipods. And so I'd go out there and there would be nothing. And so I'd talk to some colleagues, and I was kind of learning a little bit more that in the early 2000s, same sort of thing happened with one of my colleagues, and we were just trying to understand why are all of these birds concentrating here? It looks like they're feeding, but we don't know what they're feeding on. And so my colleague Bob Elner kind of went out there and has studied a little bit more and found that they're actually feeding on this thing called biofilm. And so you can see here, this is all like sandy substrate, but if you look kind of right here, there's a greenish sheen, and that's a combination of kind of algae and there's this polysaccharide matrix that it contains a number of different types of diatoms and tiny little invertebrates in it. And apparently that is what Western sandpipers and Dunlin are really keying in on. And so Bob continued on with some of his work, and since kind of the early 2000s, a number of really super interesting new discoveries have been made. And so this up here in the top left, this is a Western sandpiper tongue. You can see that there are these tiny little spines or tiny little hair type things on this tongue, and we think that those are to increase the surface area and the ability of Western sandpiper to kind of lick up this biofilm matrix, or this polysaccharide biofilm sort of algae sheen that's on top of the mud. So we can see here, this is the bird, and see his tongue come out here, and it retracts it, and then it's ingesting some of the biofilm right here. And so this is some really interesting ongoing work, and we're not entirely sure what the benefit of biofilm is, but we we do understand that the biofilm is high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. And from our understanding is that these polyunsaturated fatty acids are really important for muscle regrowth and development and repair. And so these birds, after their long migration from Mexico or Peru, are probably keying in on this biofilm, licking it up where it's highly concentrated so that they can repair their muscles so they can continue on their migration north. And so this is actually super duper recent findings that we have just published last month actually. And so this isn't a direct relationship between the number of birds at Roberts Bank and the abundance of biofilm, but it is kind of a correlation, a link between the two. So using the data that we collected since the 1990s, all of these are basically shorebird counts throughout the season or throughout the spring migration. So beginning kind of middle of April to late May. So we can see that the birds are arriving, they peak kind of early May, and then they start declining as they start moving off and head up to the Arctic. And if we relate that over multiple years, this is this color here, this is the Fraser River discharge in cubic meters per second. And so in years when there's really high discharge, in years when there's really high discharge down here, then we get really low numbers of Western sandpipers. But when there's really low discharge, so the blue up here, we're seeing really high numbers of Western sandpipers. And so we think that this is the link between the biofilm or the link between the estuary outflow, the biofilm, and the sandpipers. And so that actual, the mechanism of that link, so we can see the lower mainland here, we've got the Fraser River coming out here and this really large plume that comes out. And so Roberts Bank is right here, and this is where we do our counts. And so the idea is that this fresh water will come out, spin around here, and stress the diatoms or the biofilm to create these high concentrations of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And basically that's what the Western sandpipers are keying in on. And this is one of our most important stopover sites for shorebirds in BC. And just thinking that they're coming all the way from Peru and stopping at this really important site, I think is super fascinating. And so what we're looking to kind of, what we really don't know right now at the site is the effects of the Delta Port expansion. We don't know the importance of this specific stopover site. If this stopover site were to be removed, we don't know how that, or altered, we don't know how that would affect their populations or the migration of the species. It's kind of like if you're taking a long road trip and you see on the map that there's a gas station 100 kilometers ahead and you've got about 100 or half a tank of gas or something, and you get there and that gas station is closed, how are you going to alter, how is it going to affect basically your ability to get to the place that you want to go? And so we're using these counts, the monitoring of biofilm as kind of an index of estuary health. What we don't know right now is how long the birds are staying at Roberts Bank, and we don't know if they're just using Roberts Bank or are they heading over to Boundary Bay or going up to Iona by the airport. So those are things that we're currently looking at. And I promise I will link all of these back together shortly. And then the kind of, as we head back up north to their breeding grounds, this is kind of the one potential threat that is I probably have the most knowledge about because it's what I did my PhD on. But contrary to the decline in shorebirds, waterfowl populations have increased substantially, and this population growth has largely been driven by increases in lesser snow and Ross's goose colonies or population size. And so these population explosion has largely been driven by changes in agricultural practices in the southern United States, where these birds overwinter. And so many birds will overwinter, or as in the Pacific flyway, many birds will kind of overwinter in the kind of the Skagit River area. And so the birds are feeding on more corn and soy crops, so they have a better overall body condition. And so they have higher survival, and they have more chicks when they migrate back up to the Arctic. And so these population explosions have been potentially implicated in contributing to the declines of some shorebird populations. So as part of my PhD, we tried to look at some of that. And so the data that we had been collecting, so this is the kind of the eastern Arctic here, and each one of these little dots, that's a shorebird survey. So we were kind of went out in the helicopter, dropped down in a 300 by 400 meter plot, and we count how many shorebirds we see within that plot. And then we also know the locations and the size of goose colonies. So that's in red here. These are all the goose colonies that we have in the Canadian Arctic. And so we related the abundance of birds within the plots to the distance from the goose colonies. So we found that for a number of different shorebird species, so on the x-axis here, this is distance from goose colony, and then the y-axis, this is abundance. We see that as we move further away from the goose colony, then we're seeing more birds. And so this is a pretty clear indication that the geese on the breeding grounds are affecting the shorebirds. But at the time, we really didn't know what the mechanism of that effect is. So they're affecting them, but how are they affecting them? And so luckily, the Arctic is a relatively simple ecosystem with a relatively simple food web. So we will have shorebirds over here. At the top of the food web will be generalist predators. So this would be an Arctic fox or gulls or Jaegers. And so generalist predators would feed on shorebird eggs. They'd feed on goose eggs, and they'd feed on small mammals like lemmings or voles. And then the geese would feed on the vegetation. The small mammals would use the vegetation for nesting, and the tundra nesting shorebirds would use the vegetation for nesting as well. And we'll leave this out for simplicity right now. But the idea is that if we increase geese, how is that going to affect the generalist predators? How's that going to affect the vegetation? So there's no direct effect of geese on the shorebirds, but there may be an indirect effect one. And if so, that was the early thinking on how the potential effects. And kind of it didn't take too long for us to figure out that definitely one of the largest effects of geese on shorebirds is habitat alteration. So this is in the Churchill area, where there's a large colony of geese. And so basically this is just a goose exclusion fence. And so over multiple years, geese have been excluded from foraging in this area. They kind of rip out the grass and they graze down the grass. And over multiple years, you can see that they basically change the entire the habitat to something that looks kind of like a mossy carpet or more sandy and muddy. And it's really hard for this vegetation to regrow in that sort of habitat. So if you're a shorebird that likes or requires vegetation to build your nest and conceal your eggs from predators, then alteration of the habitat at super broad scales could have a pretty significant effect on your population. And so this is just kind of another comparison. So this picture was taken in the Eastern High Arctic in 96, 97. And you can see this is perfect habitat for many shorebirds. And then as it's grazed down, in 2017, I revisited that site, and it kind of just looks like this barren landscape now with very little opportunity for shorebirds to nest. Then the other effect that these geese can be having on shorebirds is subsidizing predators. So if you're an Arctic fox or a gull or a jaeger, and you feed on both eggs of geese and eggs on shorebirds, if there are more geese, then you're attracted to that area, first of all. And so there's some spillover to shorebird eggs. So shorebird eggs are being depredated at a much higher rate than in areas that don't have high numbers of geese. And so that kind of simplifies this. So as we increase the number of geese, then we increase the number of generalist predators. Some of those spill over and they provide some sort of predation pressure or impose predation pressure on these shorebirds. And as we increase the number of geese, then the geese eat more vegetation, and the shorebird, there's less habitat for shorebirds to nest in. And so how do each one of these 4 sites kind of link together? It's really difficult to understand that, or at least it used to be really difficult to understand that. So this is the whole Pacific flyway, and so shorebirds may face threats across that flyway. If we're just located in BC, how do we kind of understand and we're managing this population across multiple continents and countries? And so the kind of the old school way that we used to identify which birds were kind of linking each one of those sites is we would band birds. And so if a bird was caught on its nest up here, it would be banded with a little metal tag with a unique engraving on it, and it would have certain colors or engravings on its legs. And so you would report that if you saw it. So if I were out here and I saw a bird that had red with a yellow band on it, then I would report that, and we'd know that this bird was banded here and was also seen here. So it must have used this area at some point or migrated from there to there. Same goes for in kind of northern South America, so Costa Rica or Peru. If this same color coding on a Western sandpiper was seen down here, then we would know that this bird was seen or was banded here and migrated through here using these sites. So that's kind of how we can connect some of the, link some of the sites and the potential threats at those sites together. And so that's what used to happen, and it still does to a certain extent, but it requires a significant amount of banding effort because only about 5% of bands are actually resited, and it requires a significant amount of resite effort. So the exciting new technology that relates directly to Protection Island is radio telemetry. So we've been working to tag a number of shorebirds in the south and around Roberts Bank so that we can monitor their movements with radio telemetry. So we basically get an extension of what we get from banding. So a small radio tag can weigh from anywhere between 0.26 to 3 grams, so about the size of a green pea, and it's attached on the back of the bird. So it's this little tiny tag right here, and it's got kind of a little wire that comes out. And so we attach that with glue or a harness to the back of the bird. It'll fall off in about 100 days, and it will transmit, each individual tag will transmit a unique signal. And so this is the type of tag that we've been using recently. So this is a nano tag. And so we'll have a burst every about 10 seconds. It will send out a signal, and if there's a tower or a receiving station in the area, then it will record, okay, tag number 291 sent out a signal, and we recorded it here. That's basically how the basic kind of the system would work. And so this combined, this is called the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System. So it's an international collaboration research network that uses coordinated automated radio telemetry to facilitate research and education on the ecology and conservation of migratory animals. And so this is kind of what a Motus wildlife tracking station looks like. So it's got some antenna out here, and these antenna will pick up anything that's running at a 166 megahertz. It's probably a lot more complicated than any of us really need to understand. We just need to understand that it will pick up a tag at on a certain frequency from a distance. And so then there's some cords running down here. Most of the stations are run by a solar panel, except for the one at Protection Island. And then we have a little bin here that protects the actual collection device. And so this would be our bigger antenna, the 166 megahertz. And then we also have some 434 megahertz antenna, and these are the smaller ones. And this would be the tag. So the tags can actually be detected depending on the weather and depending on the location of the station. The antenna range will pick up tags from up to 10 to 15 kilometers away. Some areas, if you have ideal conditions, you can get 20 to 50 kilometers away. And these antennae require a direct line of sight. So this is what we have that connect to the antenna. So there's typically the ones in BC now we have are a sensor station. So this is basically what sits in that little Rubbermaid or Action Packer box. And it basically is, it's a little, for anybody that's into computers, it's a little Raspberry Pi, and it's attached to the antenna, and it will just continuously monitor and pick up any tags that are detected within that kind of range. And then it will collect the data and upload it. If you have Wi-Fi nearby, they will upload it to a central repository with Wi-Fi, or the newer, fancier versions, just upload it to the cell network, which is fantastic for us. And so there are a number of different receiver stations. This Motus network that was started in kind of the Eastern North America, out at Acadia University. So you can see we got pretty creative with some of these towers. If you go out to Sydney Island, last Friday we put up a station or a tower at Sydney Island on the back of we lashed it to the back of an outhouse there. That one seems to be working just fine. And so these yellow dots here are the locations for Motus towers across the world. So obviously it started kind of here in Eastern North America, but we're expanding it quite a bit out here through BC. And so this is what one of my major interests or drivers of my job right now is as a shorebird biologist in BC. So this one might look familiar to many of you. So this is the Motus station that we installed a month or two ago on Protection Island out at Beacon House. And one of my colleagues, Sydney Bliss here, says that this is her favorite location that she has ever installed a station at. And that's mainly, well, obviously it's a beautiful site, but, it's a beautiful site, but there's, I think she was really keen on it because there was already a large pole that was cemented into the ground and had electricity running to it. So we didn't have to install any sort of solar panel or anything like that. And so if we're looking at the location right here on Protection Island. So we have one antenna pointing straight out to the Strait of Georgia. We have another one pointing up towards Nanoose Bay, and another one facing back towards the estuary. And then we have two smaller of the 434 antennas pointing this direction as well. And so we're hoping that as birds move from Roberts Bank down here, as they move up this Salish Sea, that they will get picked up either in Tofino or up here at Seashell. And so we can monitor their movement as they use the area. And so this is the Motus network is a really powerful kind of wildlife tracking network. And you can create some really, really interesting figures and get really interesting data. So this is what tracking of Ipswich sparrows that my colleague had done previously. And so we can see that if birds are tagged just down here, these are the towers they're getting picked up on. And so we can see as they move between the towers, some of them move out here to Sable Island, and then they'll come back here later in the year. So we're hoping to create, we're not there yet right now in BC, but we're hoping to create these types of figures or these types of tracks as we expand the network more in BC. We can also get similar tracks like this. So these are a bunch of shorebirds that I had previously tagged in the Arctic. So they were picked up in James Bay at a number of different towers, and then we can see that some of them flew over here and they used the Bay of Fundy, but then some of them bypassed Bay of Fundy completely and kind of used these areas down here as well. And so one super interesting study that I think kind of highlights the use of this MODIS network is that using a combined data set with tracking of shorebirds using the MODIS network, my colleague Ali Anderson here in 2019, she was able to relate migration distance and body condition to shorebird migration and stopover. So she was working specifically in the James Bay area where there are 8 MODIS stations. And so they basically, along with myself in the kind of more northern Hudson Bay area, I tagged a number of birds, and then Ali tagged a number of birds using mist nets here. And we can see this bird right here has a tag on its back, and we can see that from the little wire that's sticking out right here. So they tagged those birds, and then using the migration tracks and all of the different MODIS stations, she was able to relate the relative departure fuel load, so the weight of the bird and how much fat the bird had on it, to its probability of making a stop. So basically, more fat equals fewer stops in North America. And so that's the type of stuff that we're trying to, we're planning on doing with the tracking of Western sandpipers and Dunlin in BC. So I guess one other really cool study is that you can, if you have a number of stations or receivers in really specific locations, and a bird flies and gets picked up relatively frequently among all of these different types of, between each one of those stations, sorry, then you can figure out the relative flight speed of that bird. And so this study here worked on gray-cheeked thrush migration, and they were able to relate the departure fuel load, so the percent of lean body mass. So we can just say the percent of fat on the bird, and related that to days in between detections at towers. So basically, breaking that down, so higher fuel loads, so a heavier bird or a fatter bird flew faster, but when they had low fuel loads, then they flew slower. And similar type of work was done with Swainson's thrush migration speed. But this specific study was relating it to habitat quality. So our plan is, if we're able to relate shorebirds that are using shrimp farms in Mexico, which would be the lower quality habitat, to perhaps untouched sort of coastal wetlands and mangrove areas, then we can compare those two. We can compare the flight speed and the length of stay of birds using those habitats. And so, kind of wrapping this all up, if we're looking at these birds and trying to link each one of the stopover sites and the potential threats at each one of those sites, then we think that the MODIS wildlife tracking network is probably the best way to do that. And so we've got colleagues right now in Mexico that are putting out tags in the next week, and then we've got colleagues in San Francisco Bay that will be putting out tags a couple weeks afterwards. So we're hoping that in the next month or so that we're going to be getting a number of different detections of western sandpipers moving through the Salish Sea, including the tower at Protection Island. And so this is just from some previous years' data. So this is a colleague putting out some tags down here in California. And in previous years, the birds would come up, hit Gray's Harbor right here. Half would go to Tofino and half would go to Roberts Bank. And then that was it, basically. We should, basically in 2020, we had a number of towers in Tofino. We had a number of towers in the lower mainland. But by the end of next week or the end of the month, we will have, these are all new planned locations. Some of them are already up, like the one at Protection Island. But next week, I'll be going up to Englishman Estuary, and we'll be in Courtney on Tuesday. We've already got these 2 stations installed. So we're hoping in the long run that we'll be able to track birds as they kind of move up the Salish Sea. And so as you're out around Beacon House, if you could, and you see this station, yeah, I guess this station is part of a really large network. And so birds that are getting detected at this station have been overwintering in Peru or Mexico. And we're hoping that as we expand the stations and we expand the network, that we'll be able to combine our understanding of all of these threats of the species and these threats on the species, so we can help to reverse some of the declines of many of the populations. So with that, I'll thank everybody. I don't know, I'm probably gone fairly over time right now. But here's my email address if anybody wants to email me. Yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions now.
There we go. I'm unmuted. It's Allison. I can refer to the chat bar here. So is there any research regarding microplastic content in the biofilm, especially at Roberts Bank so far?
That's an awesome question. That is something that we are planning on working on over the next couple of years. So there is, and from what we understand right now, nothing has been done with the biofilm at Roberts Bank and microplastics right now. But other research in the experimental lakes area in Ontario indicates that microplastics can affect the quality of the biofilm. So that's something that we are really interested in looking at, like kind of the combined or cumulative effects of microplastics and biofilm on shorebirds.
Would you expect that, seeing as there's a big city outfall nearby?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely the Fraser River. We're still working with colleagues to try and get some good samples for the area, because one thing that we're learning about microplastics and sampling for microplastics is that microplastics are everywhere and they can contaminate samples really, really easily. So even if you take all of the necessary precautions, then you're still going to get microplastics kind of tarnishing your samples because they're coming in from the air and coming in from different sources of water and stuff. So yeah, we're definitely working on that. It's something we're interested in the next couple of years.
Okay, there's another comment on my biofilm, and then I'll get to another question before that. But have you analyzed the diatoms in the biofilm to see if it is freshwater or marine? And this might confirm that it is high outflow from the Fraser.
Right. Well, most of the diatoms that are out here, well, at least the ones that they're feeding on, are marine diatoms. And so the thought that if they're marine diatoms and then all of a sudden as there's the freshet coming out of the Fraser River estuary, the salinity drops really quickly. And so that is what stresses the biofilm, the diatoms in particular. And so that is what increases, or when they're stressed, they start to create the polyunsaturated fatty acids at higher concentrations.
Super interesting. Okay, another question. So half of the population, when they split off from Grays Harbor, go to Tofino and half to Roberts Bank. Are you able to see if the same birds return to the same place?
That's also an awesome question. It's something that I would like to look at. But right now, so with the nano tags that we put out on the birds, they typically fall off by the time they're coming back. Or sometimes they can get pulled off. The birds typically don't like little things glued to their backs. So sometimes they'll get pulled off. But there is new technology. And the other thing is that their batteries don't last very long. So their batteries might only last a month or two. So by the time they're coming back, they often are dead if they're still on the bird. There has been some advances in the technology. So we have smaller and longer batteries for some of these tags. And so we're planning on this coming season tagging these birds with these different types of devices, and they should be lasting multiple seasons. So we'll be able to see if they're still using the same migratory pathway. And
a question, are they lithium batteries?
I don't actually know what type of batteries they are. Yeah, that's definitely not my not my expertise. I just put in an order from the guys at Low Tech, and they send me this stuff, and then I just glue them to the back of a bird.
Okay, lots of questions here. An ethical question: is there consideration about lowering the numbers of snow geese?
Yeah, that's a controversial question, believe it or not. Yeah, I mean, the largest population increases, those are mainly happening in the east. So it's mainly the mid-continental population of snow geese. So that's not the population that we typically get up here in BC. But there are some people that don't fully believe that geese are affecting shorebirds. There are some people that don't, that rely on a large snow goose population for, like a harvest. There has been an effort in 97, I think, they liberalized the snow goose hunt. So you could they increased the bag limit, and they changed the type of hunting that you could do, or the techniques that you used. And that put a small dent in the population, but the understanding now is that the population is beyond what kind of a liberalized harvest is able to control. But there is some indication that some of the colonies have reached some sort of density dependence, so their population growth hasn't been as exponential as previously, or it's slowed. Yeah.
Okay. How many birds are banded per flock, and does the burst every 10 seconds harm the birds at all?
Right. So banded birds per flock. Well, as far as I know, there are only myself and my colleagues are the only ones that are tagging Western sandpipers right now. And so during the northward migration, there might be 80 tags in total put out, and there are hundreds of thousands of shorebirds. So I don't know if I could say necessarily how many per flock.
Per thousand. How many per thousand?
Or how many per, yeah, or even how many necessarily per thousand. Yeah. And in the last 10 years, there hasn't been a huge effort for banding the birds. So we don't really have a really good estimate of how many birds are banded per flock or anything like that.
But probably, if you're just studying the route of the migration, most of the birds are going to follow the same route in any one year anyway, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. How is the abundance of shorebirds and availability of biofilm affected by the tidal cycle versus the Fraser discharge?
Right. That is something that has been looked at. So For shorebirds, we typically have, we're seeing higher numbers of shorebirds when the tide is kind of like, well, our counts usually happen when the tide is kind of like mid-tide. It's the easiest time to see the shorebirds. How does the tide affect the biofilm? So as at low tide, really, really low tide, then if the biofilm will get stressed every day as the tide changes, as it starts to dry out. But our understanding, it's a combination of the tidal cycle and the Fraser discharge, but I think the Fraser discharge is kind of like a happens. It's kind of like a more of an acute event that happens like at a certain period with a really large kind of extreme change in the salinity every year. So we think that the discharge probably over the long term has the largest effect on the biofilm.
How can we find out the tracking results from our PI MOTIS station?
Excellent question. So if you go to, I think I had it on my slides, which I don't know, I'm not sharing anymore, am I?
No.
Okay. Well, if you go to www.motus.org, so
Type it down in here.
Oh yeah, MOTUS.org, then you can go on the MOTIS website and there will be a tab where you can look at the locations of each one of the stations. You can basically zoom in on the station from Protection Island, and you can see that this bird from this project was picked up on this date. And you can see the other towers that bird was picked up. So that's like kind of the coarsest scale level that you can look at, or probably for the most part, the finest scale that you could look at. There is a lot more data that are collected, but that requires some significant coding skills and statistical skills. And so unless if you're really interested in it, then you can definitely email me and I can try and provide you with some. But if you're just looking at this bird was detected here at what time, then yeah, you can just go to the motus.org and it provides you with all that sort of information. It's really cool to just look at, click on the little yellow dot and see, oh, this bird was just picked up here.
Yeah, super.
It's really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. So one last question: does each bird species tagged with the transmitter have a different frequency? Are they all the same, but the transmitter is programmed to send different info?
They're all on the same frequency. So two types of tags. One's the 166 and one's the 434 megahertz. The tags do have different burst rates. So some will ping every 3 seconds, but that reduces your battery life. Some will ping every 30 seconds. That doesn't necessarily, that's not kind of structured by species. So whenever we get the tags, we have to take a recording of the tag, and then we upload that tag recording along with the species that we're putting it out on. And then from that, we're able to basically, like the website is able to figure out, okay, this species has this tag, or this individual has this tag. Yeah, so two different frequencies, not species dependent. The burst rate is also not species dependent. It's just each individual tag based on its frequency or unique signature of bursts. That's how we like link that up on the website. That's how you're able to distinguish between each individual.
Great. Well, that was super interesting. I just have a quick observation about the cultural importance of birds. When you were talking about that at the beginning of your talk, I couldn't help but think about Silent Spring.
Yeah.
Rachel Carson published in 1962, and it's widely considered the beginning of the modern environmental movement. So there's that idea of a silent spring, of birds not being with us in the spring, is such a powerful, like birds hold a lot of powerful cultural content for us.
And I think they link so many people. They link like partners in Mexico and partners in California and partners in Alaska. And I really like that part of working on a long distance migrant. It's really cool.
Yeah, and you've really brought us that sense of the global as well as the local, like
I hope so. Yeah, sorry, I definitely went well over time, but
that's fine. You've linked those things together in a great way. So thank you very much.
yeah, no problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Rick or Emily, are you gonna say a couple of words too? I don't know.
Yes, so that was super interesting, Scott. Every time I think our speaker has been the best speaker of the year. Just, the next one is just as good or better. So pretty super interesting. The site at Beacon House is hopefully it's running well and you're getting lots of good information there. There was a question on the chat about what happens if the power goes out. So interestingly enough, the site that was chosen, the power actually comes from the bottle shed, which is actually federal government power anyways. So it's all working out pretty well there. And it's the same power that runs the lighthouse. So I assume there's some kind of a backup system there. So we probably wouldn't lose power for too long. But Scott and his crew were just awesome to deal with. They were super professional, very fast. And I think it's something that's going to do us all a lot of good for a long time. So thank you again, Scott. That was a fantastic talk. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Next Sunday, Andrew Cameron's going to talk about COVID. So that's going to be a timely topic. So same time next week, and that kind of leads me into the little segue. Yesterday we had a tour with VHA, excuse me, to Beacon House. So they're pretty excited about the facility and the ability to host a pretty decent clinic there. So we should know in the next couple of days as far as timing and whether they're going to be able to do the whole community and stuff. So once they're just trying to do some calculations based on how many stations, how many people they can do, and whether it can be a 1 day or 2 day type event. So once we know something, we'll put something out so everybody will know more. And then April 11th, Craig Taylor is going to do a talk on his new book, New Yorkers. And hopefully by then we're going to be able to have a small audience for him on the deck at Beacon House and support that with Zoom so everybody else on the island can watch as well. And don't forget May 1st and 2nd, PI Players, Savannah Sipping Society. So that's all the announcements for me. So thank you, everyone. I don't know, Emily, if you have anything else you need to